Hello and welcome to this video on how medical devices get approved. Whether it is a new type of replacement hip, insulin pump, screw, surgical tool and more, they all need approval of some kind. In the USA, this is from the FDA. The kinds of approval received will vary somewhat, but despite this, there are two primary pathways. There are devices that are similar to existing devices, and then there's a pathway for something completely novel. Each has its own quirks, problems, and strengths. For general purposes, each class of product or device has its own category, and each category has its own general rules for oversight. Class 1 is perhaps the least stringent and is generally the least invasive, if invasive at all. You then have Class 2 that are more invasive, but generally they're not something that will remain within the body, whereas Class 3 is the most invasive and generally a permanent prosthesis of some kind. Each of them will get some kind of difference in the approval they get. As a general rule, Class 2 will get a pre-market notification or a clearance, and Class 3 will receive a pre-market approval. This also leads into two terms that are important: FDA approved and FDA cleared. The FDA regulates all devices in America, and there are similar agencies in just about all other jurisdictions in the world. For the most part, it's important to note that FDA approved is closer to a device that has gone through the entirety of the range of approvals required by the FDA. This normally involves extensive clinical trials and testing, along with a lot of data to support it. These are the hardest hurdles to pass. FDA cleared is a much lower threshold, and is generally related to something that is very similar to other products already available. You could think of it as the difference between a similar device and a completely novel device. Similar devices are the most common development pathway at the moment, and that is because it is the least onerous route. Fundamentally, the similar device pathway is meant for devices that are very close to existing systems or devices, and in some cases derivatives thereof. For lack of a better analogy, think of regular table sugar, that's otherwise known as sucrose. Then you have glucose, which is still a sugar, just more refined, and a smaller part of what makes up sucrose. Then you have your range of artificial sweeteners. Depending on the application, all of these can be considered similar. Sucrose and glucose are learned digestible sugars, but all three provide sweetness. In this system, you could get sucrose approved and later glucose. Then you could get artificial sweeteners approved as a sweetener, but not as a sugar. Because if you're using it as something digestible, it's not digestible, therefore not similar. But if all you're after is the sweetness effect, it's exactly the same, just more potent. This process is called FDA cleared or cleared. It's because the devices are substantially equivalent to what is already approved. It's a real-world example of, hey, can I copy your homework? This element of the approval process does, however, have an alarming weakness. That is, you can daisy chain a long series of developments by working from what is an already approved device to something that has very little relationship to the original approved device, simply by making iterative adjustments in successive applications. And that's the downside. Some devices approved now can trace their, let's say, ancestry. It can trace their devices back decades, if not even more again. And that's because the original device then gave rise to a new device that was similar but a little bit different, and then each successive device after that moved further and further away. This is why the FDA has what are fundamentally two criteria they use to decide whether or not it should go down this pathway. The first is that is it intended for the same application as its predecessor and have what is fundamentally the same technology or specifications as what it's derived from. That is it a ball and socket joint to replace a hip? That's exactly the same technology, and its specifications are fundamentally the same. However, as has been, let's say, exposed with the weaknesses of this approach, sometimes changes in the technology underlying it can cause that device to fail spectacularly, despite being approved because it was exactly the same. The other criteria is, are they intending to use this new version of something for exactly the same purpose as the old thing without significant technological changes that alter the safety or danger profile of what you're dealing with. This is an example of that change in the hip joint, where they should have figured out that using the different technology, particularly inside a human body that is biologically active, is what led to massive problems. While not exactly the same, it is similar to the idea of medications being approved and patented. The generic product, if it has the same active ingredient, can also use the original approval and patent data. That is because it is the same drug, just made by another company. The FDA doesn't require them to go through all of the exact same, very arduous and difficult clinical trials to get it approved, because that's already been done, so long as they're not deviating from the original product. The other criteria, so to say, is like a drug that is functionally the same, but achieves the results by targeting a different step or process. Therefore, it must undergo the same sort of testing, but maybe not as much as the brand new drug would. Novel devices are fundamentally something that requires some sort of pre-market approval. That is, if you want to get approval to be able to sell these, they need to get pre-market approval in order to be able to just get clinical trials up and running. And the reason for this is they need to demonstrate that the product is safe and effective. Remember, these are the sorts of things that will be inside someone's body permanently. Replacement hips and knees are good examples. But then you have things like pacemakers, insulin pumps, and more. All of these have to have a much more stringent safety profile and approval process, because they will be what keeps someone alive, or at least prevent them from having massive losses in their quality of life. For example, needing to have their leg amputated because, well, they're going to break their femur and die from that otherwise. The reason Class 3 is so much more stringent, and why it needs the special kind of approval, is that they are genuinely novel. That is, they are the cutting edge of technology. The PMA is very stringent, and the reason for that is, as said, these are generally permanent devices that haven't really been seen before. That's why the safety profile needs to be so well established, and applications for these can run to the length of several theses. They are very big applications, and another reason why they take years to work through. They also do generally require clinical trials, because that's what's going to give them the necessary data to show any possible benefits outweigh any possible known risks. And the benefit to risk ratio is what the FDA will be balancing. Medical devices that are used for clinical purposes are generally going to fall into these categories, but there's another grey area. This grey area is not so much from the FDA, but by the medical practitioners using these things, and it's called off-label medical devices. These are devices that are being used for purposes for which they have not received approval. This is one way in which data can be generated, although admittedly questionably, and it's, let's say, controversial. Despite being controversial, it is somewhat widespread. For example, the Johnson & Johnson lawsuits about the use of mesh implants. The issue was that they were being used off-label for something that they weren't meant to be used for, and this led to massive complications, long-term pain and suffering for individuals, and significant number of lawsuits that are still being resolved even now. The advantages to doing this, assuming everything works as intended, is that there's more data generated about possible novel applications of existing devices. This then allows submissions to be made to the FDA to have existing devices reapproved but with new purposes attached to it. The final step in all of this, after the FDA has approved these devices to go to market, is called post-market surveillance or post-marketing surveillance. It's the process by which the FDA or other regulatory agencies monitor the products released under any system that they're operating, whether that is the completely novel device or the existing device that's been modified and, let's say, a new generation being made. It is, in a manner of speaking, very similar to VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. That is, any unknown, unpredictable, or adverse outcomes are reported and listed. If, for the sake of an example, you have 1,000 implants and there's one infection failure or something else, it may not be a problem. That's because it could simply be a bad situation. If there are 10 concerns raised, still may not be a worry. If there are 50, now you begin to see that there may not only be a problem, but a pattern. It's all a matter of how much data is being generated and how specific and consistent it is. 50 implants out of 1,000 probably is enough to get some eyebrows raised and questions being asked. 50 and 10,000 may not be, as particularly if there's a wide variety of things that are being reported, and none of them are consistently being reported. As you can see, the approval of new medical devices and implants is in some ways very similar to the approval process of pharmaceutical products. The only difference is that a second category exists to allow the development and deployment of similar devices or implants with a lot less regulatory oversight, and in some ways that's a weakness of this system. But it's there to try and allow not only greater development and ingenuity, but also to give greater options to the wider population. If you have more competition amongst these companies, at least in theory, prices would come down, but more importantly, you can get something that's more suitable to each individual, rather than having to rely on one strict setting or version of things that may or may not work as intended. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.